Cults can be dangerous and all-consuming. Beware, don't be drawn in. For now though, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your robe and let the darkness take control. My parents decided to attend a Christian church that was very much a cult when I was 3 and my brother was 5. As far as I can recall, my dad only attended a few times. When I was to start kindergarten, they also enrolled us both in the private Christian school which was associated with the church. We were taught through the ACE program, which was just a small part of this whole cult. The first red flag was that it was 100% mandatory for attendees of the school to also attend the church. As you got older, they also monitored your church attendance. If you got in the red, i.e. not enough attendances, then certain extracurricular things were taken away. For example, performing in choir or basketball games. As kids, we were spanked over the knee by a male principal, with no parents present. Church members had sexually abused younger children, and it just got swept away under the carpet. We were taught from quite young that anyone who didn't attend our church was a sinner, and we needed to help save them. I remember being 5 years old, sitting on the playground by my childhood home, trying to convince my best friend why she was a bad person and needed Jesus. It was very, very frowned upon to have friends outside the church and school, and as I grew up, my oddness pushed all possible friends away. Now this school had rules: no talking about movies, books, music, comics, etc. if they were secular, aka not made by a Christian. We were always in uniform, and boys and girls sat at different tables in the lunchroom. In class, there was no talking allowed, unless it was to the teacher, and you worked according to the accelerated Christian education. There was also no talking allowed in the changing room for gym class until grade 6, for fear that we were talking about bad things when the adults weren't around. When your friends or relatives decided to leave the organization, the pastor would get up on a Wednesday night, listed as a members-only night sermon, and address that the family has gone against God and left. He would also slander them and make up lies about how ungodly they were, and that if we let our children associate with them, they would be tainted by the influence of Satan. The pastor had this thing he would do when a family brought it up in a meeting, the fact that they wanted to go to another church. He would tell them, "Okay, you go to pray to God in your homes, and I'll do the same. We'll come back tomorrow and discuss." The next day, the pastor would come back and say, especially to the wealthy families, "God has told me that this is still your home, and that you belong here." Of course, the family would let him know that God has told them it's time to go. The pastor would immediately say, "Well, I am the pastor, and I hear from God." you are tainted by other factors influencing this decision. If you go against my direction today, you are going against God. There was this mandatory Bible camp that was attended by any teenager from ages 12 to 18. It took place in the school and church, and it was religious teachings for 6 days straight. We were not permitted contact with our parents, and admission to the school was not allowed if you didn't attend. I was 12 years old, with pneumonia and a severely infected wisdom tooth, and I was not allowed to stay home. I was also not allowed to have my medicine on me, as I was a minor and had to literally chase down an adult who was clueless on my condition to let me in the room. When they found out you had Facebook, they dragged you into an office without parents and told to log into the Facebook so that they could check it, to ensure that you weren't up to no good. If you refused, you were suspended. Your parents were instructed to paddle you, i.e. spank you with a large object, and some were even directed to kick you out. Parents listened because the fear that their other children would be tainted by this bad apple. Many families were torn apart. You weren't taught about sex at all. You weren't even allowed to be alone with guys, even just to go to the play hard together, and no dating until 18. That is when you were deemed old enough, and you had to ask the pastor's permission to date the person and immediately attend counseling sessions to help you grow towards God together. You needed the church's permission to marry, and most were informed that they were getting married less than a year into dating. When you started grade 9, you had to sign a contract that you would attend Bible college after graduating high school. If you didn't sign it, your life was made hell. You were pulled into meetings, counseling sessions, suspended, and if you didn't follow through the same thing, but instead of the suspension, your parents were told to outcast you. There's so much more, but it's been 7 years since I left, and I'm still broken and torn over all we went through. My mother was so naive, and she let us be manipulated and abused because she knew nothing else. We left after many members had already faced the wrath of your whole community and world being torn apart. A lot of truths about the financial lies and lies about other members were brought to light. We left because of the way they manipulated us, our family, and my brother, which is a whole nother story. And we left because my parents finally got just how screwed up the place was. I only survived because I learnt to live a double life. When I was 9, I told my friend that the walls have ears. Nothing you say is safe. I sheltered the sacred parts of me and only let them out in the dark from ages 9 on. But even then, I was brainwashed so badly. I grew up believing that everyone outside of this organization was bad, and I needed to be saved from them. We weren't allowed to wear makeup or paint our nails until grade 9, and all outfits worn, even to church, other non-school events, had to fit into the guidelines given. You were to act godly 100% of the day. If you even tried to stand up for yourself, you were hurled into the principal's office. I remember when I was assigned my counselor. She was a 26-year-old new mother who had just married her husband. She would assign me Bible verses to read, and I had to come up with insightful things to say about how it changed my life. I found out a new session in that my best friend told her something in confidence. We were told the room was a cone of silence, but it got told to 3 female elders and the pastor's wife. The next day, she didn't show up to school and was suspended for a week. I realized that day that these sessions were only there to monitor us and make us feel valued, in order to have a line in on our lives. I used to think to practice diverting this onto things about her life and how her baby was. I wanted to make sure I never let it slip what my life was like outside the organization, for fear of the repercussions. I was in a cult when I was a teenager. What was weird is that it wasn't one of the typical ones. It was just a Christian church, but ran like a cult. Here are a few rules. Children had to attend their school to avoid corruption, temptation, and science. Oh yes, science was evil. No care should be given to appearance to avoid vanity or sexuality. This included jewelry, hair products, and even perfume. Girls should not talk to boys or men without other people present, lest we tempt them to sin. All music must be glorifying God, or it cannot be listened to. You must donate 20% of your income. Everyone must donate at least 10 hours a week to the church. We had food banks, hot dinners for the homeless, and even charity clothes shop. It was weird, you didn't even realize it was a cult until you were so far in. Friendly people, lots of charitable work, and sermons straight out of the Bible made it seem normal and even good. Hey, join the school, it's private education for free. Except it was horrible education. As an excellent student previously there, had me teach the younger kids instead of me learning anything. Don't be vain or dress slutty, sounds fine, until you're told as a teen to switch brands of body wash because the smell of you is tempting. Luckily, my parents and I started questioning things at the same time. I can't imagine being trapped in something like that now. The entirety of my father's side of the family are Jack Mormon fundamentalists. My grandfather was the head of the cult, and he died about a decade back. But my grandmother now heads it as the matriarch. She was outcast from the Mormon church because he still accepted polygamy as the church dogma. They had 17 children. Some of my older uncle and aunts live on a ranch in Mexico. Most homeschool their children. They use corporal punishment. I didn't know much about it until I stayed with my father one summer on my uncle's ranch in Utah. He has 3 wives and a lot of children. Mostly, we were left to our own devices and helped do chores. I ended up letting Dad baptize me and my brother and told my mum about it. She was pissed off, and I didn't really get why until later. One of my cousins, who I happened to know at the ranch, was traded for my uncle's youngest wife. She was given to one of the most insidious cult leaders of the bunch, who was also married to one of my aunts. I even attended the wedding, though I was young. She ended up in the hospital after the wedding, and no one knew if she'd be able to have children after that. I have no idea what happened, but it sounds like a lot of violence and rape. Anyway, that guy died of cancer, luckily. I know it's terrible to say, but from what I heard, he tortured his wives and children big time and was extremely controlling. Perhaps he could have treated the cancer had he trusted hospitals. My aunt's daughters got out of it, thankfully. The cousin who endured the trauma ended up being married off to his sister's husband. Now, my father escaped when he was around 16. He doesn't see it that way. The programming was pretty harsh, but he left to work on his own as a carpenter, a fairly common family trade. He was offered a scholarship to go to college, but was unable to accept because the grandparents refused to stop claiming him as a dependent. Anyway, when he had my brother and I, he brought us up teaching us about these things, but not in an authoritarian way. I think he was too empathetic, even if subconsciously, to do to us what was done to him. He grapples with self-hatred and depression. He's an alcoholic and refuses to go to hospitals or get any kind of help psychologically. Grandpa instilled a lot of social mistrust or physically dispute being functionally disabled now. He can barely work. He has an aversion to computers. That's what his scholarship would have paid for. So he's bitter about never being able to understand them. And most of the time, doesn't have a working phone or running water. His beliefs have left him totally isolated by his ex-wives, but then also by his own family as an outcast. My uncle gave him a house so that he's not homeless, but he's basically a mess of a person. Whenever I try to talk to him or change his mind about any of it, he just yells about wildly contradictory belief systems that he holds in his head and does nothing to change his situation. He thinks that he is being punished for the evil things he did as a child. For example, he shot a bird with a BB gun and didn't eat it, which would be the crime part. He refuses to let go of any of the beliefs because he says he witnessed miracles as a child, like people being healed with the touch of God, fires going out in a burning building, and praying to God to stop the demon voices in his head. I tried to explain to him how memories work and how malleable they are, especially in a cult, but he refuses to accept that his life was a lie. I've seen him consider it, but if he accepted it, it might just drive him mad. Not that he's not mad already. He's tried to commit suicide, but because he's failed several times, he says God won't let him die. The cult left him totally unable to deal with society or life. Another cousin of mine had a particularly rough time, mostly because she was labelled as a rebel and refused to conform to the authoritarian parenting of another uncle and his wife. She wasn't allowed to wear all black, shorts above her fingertips, or show her shoulders. When the wife finally started letting the children go to public school, she would refuse to let them go as punishment. Her parents basically gave up on her and let her move in with her abusive boyfriend when she was 15. Now, we enjoy going to family reunions in bikinis while the poor girls from Mexico wear tons of clothes to swim. She lives with me now, and she's doing tons better. When she first came to visit, she was miserable and suicidally depressed. I am glad she's out of that tiny, awful town. The great thing is that all of my uncle's children have been deconverting one by one once they move out. Lots of other cousins are getting out too, which is really cool. Mostly, it's because of having attended public school or college. They try to keep you out of it for a reason, apparently. The best road to deconversion is education. I forgot to mention one of the most messed up things. Apparently the grandparents had a child named Julianne. They made the older girls watch the younger girls, because that's what you do when you have way too many children. So my 12-year-old aunt had to watch a 2-year-old child. Julianne, the 2-year-old, drowned because she wasn't being properly watched. What scares me is that she wasn't born in a hospital and didn't have a social security number. Probably no authorities know that she was born and died of child neglect, and no one was punished. I was raised in a conservative evangelical church. Dad left the family when I was 6, and I'm an only child. I was always very close and protective of my mother. I'm male, and I always knew I liked boys. I grew up constantly deeply ashamed of myself. I was 16 when I finished high school, and in the summer holidays before I intended to start uni, I took a 3-week camp run by Youth with a Mission, called the Summer of Service. There was a lecture in the first week of the camp where we were taught on the importance of confession. I was already entirely familiar with doctrine, that if you have unconfessed your sins in your heart, then God can't hear your prayers. But the speaker convicted me about it more strongly than I'd ever felt before. A couple of weeks prior, I had received a 33.6 kilobyte dial-up modem for my birthday, as it was in 1996, and I saw gay porn for the first time, so I was feeling extraordinarily guilty at the time. The camp told us that confessing to God in personal prayer was adequate to receive forgiveness, but that if the sin was heavier than we knew how to cope with, we were welcome to confess to any of the camp leaders in 100% confidence of privacy. So, I told my group leader about the porn and that I like boys, not girls. He told another group leader, and they told the camp leader, who fed this up the chain to the base leader, who told her husband, and next morning, I was sat down with a meeting with all 5 of them. They told me it was their moral duty to help me heal from my homosexuality, and the best way to accomplish this was for me to join YWAM full-time. I was reticent to even consider giving up my plans to study computer science at university. I was told that a secular university would corrupt me, and I would end up openly gay and in rebellion to Christ. I genuinely wanted to be straight and to do what was right with God, so I wanted the help they were offering. Ultimately, the kicker was that they said if I didn't agree to do a discipleship training school and join YWAM, then the base leader would be compelled to tell my mom about my same-sex attraction. I couldn't bear how it would hurt her, and so I gave in and joined. That's when they started the first 11 exorcisms performed on me over the next 4 years of my ex-gay therapy. They were brutal, horrible ordeals, and they were terrifyingly real. One of the more challenging aspects of deprogramming my lifelong Christian indoctrination, when I eventually left therapy, and the church was coming to terms with just how convincing real demon forces had apparently demonstrated themselves to be in my experience. At first, when my worldview had motivated past the almost comical biblical interpretation of angels and demons, but not yet abandoned all sense of spirituality, I rationalized that the seemingly supernatural aspects of what happened. I spoke with voices that did not sound like mine. I am normally a diminutive, fairly gentle person. I became viciously violent, and it felt like I was in possession of superhuman strength. It took many adult men to restrain me. My vision turned blood red, and I genuinely felt suspended, while other forces, personalities even, controlled me internally, like a puppet, as being the spiritual manifestations, outworkings from efforts being made to essentially rip part of my soul. As a naturalist now, I no longer see myself as having a soul in any spiritual manner. However, I still think there is something to my former perspective of the strange happenings in my exorcism experience that might have been manifestations entirely to be expected. Like I said, I'm gay. That's a very significant part of my identity. And though both the daily activities of my ex-gay therapy and through the torture of exorcism itself, my identity, perhaps I could say the soul without meaning anything supernatural, was being torn. So possibly on an unconscious level, there were forces within me that acted to try and protect me. I went to Russia for my DTS. It was fairly hellish practice to be a 17-year-old in 1997. I had friends tortured by the Gai, which are a kind of police. I had friends taken hostage by extreme Muslims. We thought they were dead, but eventually they did get released, and I had to be smuggled out the country in the end. After my DTS, I was sent to a School of Intercession, Worship and Spiritual Warfare in Israel, and then I helped run more of those schools back in Australia. I spent 4 years with YWAM in ex-gay therapy. As far as my family and friends were concerned, I was working as a missionary. I kinda was doing that along the way. Around the end of 2000, I was so crushed by my utter lack of progress of healing, and facing the realization that the only way to maintain my faith was to live my entire life celibate and single. I did not believe I was capable of that, and felt betrayed by God. I was suicidal. I made plans of how to end my life a few times, but I couldn't follow through. Finally, one day, I told my base leader I was having doubts and we started arguing. It went badly, and within the hour my bags were packed for me, and I was escorted off the base and told to go away. 4 years and it was over just like that. I went home for a few months, but when I started to come out of the closet, my mum kicked me out of the home and made me excommunicated from the church, where most of my friends and family went. So in early 2001, I ran away to Sydney and started living my life, my way, and for myself, for the first time ever. It was incredibly terrifying and liberating at the same time. I still feel damaged by everything I went through, but I'm happy with myself now, and I'm glad at least for what I learnt about life through it all. Now, they call themselves American Buddhists. It was a cult led by the late Frederick Lenz Jr., aka Atmanandana, aka Zen Master Rama. No actual relation to Buddhism. Pushed students into high-paying careers, then made sure to extract as much as possible out of them. Back in the early days of the internet, I started asking online about him. He caught wind and called me out on the carpet, with his bodyguards in full force. I played the good little meek student there, but afterwards realized it was all about control. I just stopped going, but they didn't try to keep me in. It was an opt-in sort of cult. Frederick Lenz committed suicide in 1998. Not to put to a fine point on it, he had his students lie on their resumes. When I say they gave him money, they would sleep 4 in a room on the floor while working software development jobs. At the time I joined, they had an age cutoff. They didn't want anyone over 29. I figure there are 2 reasons for that. The good reason is that by 30, we've acquired enough baggage that spiritual development is more complicated and actually implies laziness at best. If they don't, just adjusting training methods depending on age. The bad reason is that young people are a lot easier to manipulate. I was borderline at the time, having turned 30. I think a combination of just being past the malleable phase and general bloody mindlessness are what made it possible for me to leave. I was in a cult. I was at a homeless shelter, having dinner, and this guy struck up a conversation with me. He told me about this program that would feed me, house me, get me clean and sober for free. It was the dead of winter, and I was in a very bad spot. I was willing to try anything to get clean and get my life sorted out. I told him to give me a night to think it over. I think it over in a tent in the woods, and the next day I called him from the courtesy phone in the hospital, and he drove me out to this property in the marshland, just off the highway in a town I'd never heard of. My intake was on the 11th of January 2012. I didn't realize it was a cult until I'd been there a day. By then, the guy who drove me in was gone, but they fed me, I got a warm bed and a friendly welcome. This could be an entire novel, but I'll pare it down to the main points. We had some very strict rules here. We were not allowed women. There was no nicotine or caffeine, as they'd check for both. We weren't allowed white bread, no reading material that wasn't assigned, no phone calls, and no outgoing mails. There was also no leaving the property, unless supervised by a cadre or escorted by a Phase 3 or higher. I heard that someone got kicked out because they were on the bus and their escorts saw them talk to someone they recognized. Easily, the strangest thing was webcast. I don't even know why they called it that, and I learnt not to ask a lot of questions, because that would land you in the hot seat. The hot seat was a chair in the middle of a small windowless room in the east end of the building. Classes were held in 2 rooms across the hall. If someone was in the hot seat, whomever was teaching the class, usually one specific cadre, would start by saying that this was a special occasion, because one of our brothers was in the hot seat. Everyone knew who it was. Then the cadre would call a short list of names in no particular order and excuse them to the room across the hall. He'd put a phrase in charge of the classroom and we'd all go over to the next room. Once inside, we sat in a circle. There would be a chair in the middle of the room. Then the cadre would come in and shut the door and say, "Mr. Howard, you're in the hot seat today." And the person would sit in the chair and the cadre would explain the process. Mr. Howard is going to sit there quietly and listen whilst each of us tells him something about himself that we can't stand. Mr. Howard is going to maintain eye contact with whoever is speaking and will go around until everyone has had a turn. If there's time, we'll go round again. No one is to say anything uplifting or edifying to Mr. Howard, and no one is to laugh. If you need to use the bathroom, wait until we dismiss. The rule was no laughing, but it still happened and the cadre let it slide, as even cults have a sense of humour. So then the cadre picks someone and that person says their piece. An example I remember is a particularly nasty one. A guy we'll call Seth had been friends with the guy in the hot seat. but now he disliked him a lot, for the same reason that landed him in the hot seat in the first place. Seth berated this guy for 10 minutes. At one point, he turned to the cadre and said, "I don't know why you even keep Howard around. Is he like the mascot? He's just a rabid dog, wandering around, biting people." There were laughs, and the cadre said, "Direct your question to Mr. Howard." And so Seth did. He went on about how Howard smelled bad and how we should all stop him from getting seconds at any meals because he's such a fat slob. The hard part is watching the guys who are genuinely very nice have to sit there and say something hurtful to their friend. That happened with Howard. Just about everyone hated him, but this one guy. And when it was his turn, he told him that he hated being roommates with him, and a bunch of other stuff, and Howard cried. When he put his hands up to cover his eyes, the cadre said, "Maintain eye contact," and Howard had to look at his friends with tears and snot running out of his face. It was pretty awful. I honestly think a moderate beating would have been less painful for everyone involved. By the end of the hour, the room has actually cooled down a bit, since everyone got out all the shit they had to get out. And as bad as it was, everyone who was in the hot seat would later say they felt a lot better after it happened. There was generally someone in the hot seat once a week, even people who weren't red, yellow, or orange. But anyway, back to Webcast. This was essentially a big room full of chairs, like a chapel, called the Fellowship Hall. There were big speakers and a giant projector screen on the back wall. When the webcast was announced over the PA, everyone filled into the hall and the lights went down. Then a video would play, but it was mostly giant words flashing on the screen for a moment and then being replaced by more words. This was accompanied by a loud male voice doing a weird narration. The first one I ever saw said approximately, "You're in a cage. There is a being outside the cage." The word cage flashed on screen. "There are two men in the cage with you. The being opens the cage and you're free. You run into the darkness. You remember the two men in the cage. You have to run back and save them. Save them. You run back to the cage." On and on like this. But it was a parody of a brainwashing scene from a Warner Brothers cartoon. I remember realizing that I'd gotten myself into something. I wasn't scared, not of the other guys at least, but there were around 60 of us. The cadre would always joke that we were living with 60 of our best friends. What scared me was the idea that the ridiculous attempts at brainwashing would eventually, over time, have an effect on me. You could leave the property unsupervised for 9 months of blackout. Then you could transmission into being a phase. A phase could escort men into town and back, and were allowed to listen to the radio. And sometimes, one of the cadre would take you to a concert or a movie, but it would usually just be hikes, where he would blow this stupid horn intermittently, and no one could talk. Anyway, I was able to keep it together, and not become like the others. They weren't super crazy, just anchored very deeply in their beliefs, a far-off cousin of Christianity. Punishment was not extreme, but it was actually very unpleasant. When you intake, you're assigned a colour. Green is new, blue is higher, then silver, then purple, and then you became a phase. If you messed up, you were a yellow, and you lost privileges. No seconds during meals, early bedtime extra chores. It went all the way to red before you got kicked out. But orange was the worst. If you were orange, no one was allowed to talk to you at all. And you had to spend an hour in the hot seat. Like I said before, I'll spare the bulk of the story. I was in the program for a year. I never saw the guy who brought me there again. I was in transition for 3 months and had just become a phase when I got kicked out. The exit was pretty straightforward. You were escorted out in one of the vans, and you couldn't get anything from your room, and were driven into town where they would just drop you off and leave. No one was allowed to talk to you, or they would be exited too. Then you were on your own, in the middle of nowhere. Saying this, I'm still surprised that I entered and exited a cult, but I'm still clean and sober, and have a much better life now. So I guess it was worth it, and at least I got a couple of stories to tell. It is obviously not the worst cult that you can go to, but still, not everyone makes it out, and that's something that you have to keep in mind. I met a guy in Seattle back in 2006. Wish I could remember his name. He was a hardcore punk and always wore a kilt. Anyway, he told me about his experience in a cult. He was kind of weak-willed. If you said pretty please, he would do just about anything you wanted. So it didn't surprise me. Not sure how he ended up getting recruited, but what I do know was what life inside the cult was like. They ate nothing but rice. I mean, nothing but rice. And small portions too. If you're malnourished, you're more susceptible to suggestion and too weak to fight back. Sleep deprivation was also a mainstay of the cult. New members were deprived of sleep to break their minds and spirits. They also had a noise room. They played loud noises through a speaker and had incredibly bright lights. This was used as punishment for transgressions. My friend said he was never put in the room, but heard about it. I forget what he said the cult was preparing for, possibly a comet alien invasion, or just good old-fashioned end of the world. He said that almost all of the time in the cult was spent in the barn, where he and other cult members would sew wallets to sell to fund cult activities and their lawyers. They did have a team of attorneys, and just like that King of the Hill episode, they would use them on whoever badmouthed them or tried to rescue a cultist. His parents ended up hiring a PI who straight up kidnapped him one day when they were in town selling wallets. I mean, van pulls up, door slides open, he gets tossed in, tied up, bag over his head, the works. They took him somewhere for another re-brainwashing. This is the part that always struck me. The unbrainwashing techniques are really the same thing the cult did to him, except teaching him to hate the cult instead of love it. The part of the story that always struck me was how normal he was after it all. The guy lived in a barn with 30 people sewing wallets, eating nothing but rice and hardly sleeping, having no contact with any other members of his family. And none of it struck him as odd. I grew up in a UPCI church until they weren't conservative enough. So our church decided to leave the organization and only associate with other extremely conservative Pentecostal churches. For example, we weren't supposed to fellowship with anyone who didn't have the same holiness standards as us. Examples of these standards: women weren't allowed to cut their hair, wear pants, makeup or jewellery. No TV was allowed or internet in your homes. Men couldn't wear shorts, and everyone had to wear long-sleeved shirts. Certain reading materials were prohibited, no alcohol was allowed to be consumed, and any music that wasn't suitable for Sunday morning service wasn't allowed to be listened to, period, including contemporary Christian music. Some people weren't even supposed to communicate with their family members. I left eventually, after learning about the cult, and about science, history and religion and archaeology at college and online. I also learned about sexual abuse, embezzlement, emotional and other physical abuse that had taken place over the years at the church. After confronting the pastor, who may never be questioned about such matters, I was pretty much excommunicated for 2 years. I've been doing better since then, but I still suffer for having been brought up in a cult. I managed to also rescue my sister from there a few months ago, and we're much happier now. I still lost a lot of my friends, but I've been able to make new ones. I'm now more agnostic than religious. I accidentally joined the World Mission Society Church of God, which is a Korean cult that believes in a man named Ahn Sang-hong as the second coming of Christ, and the current leader is a woman who he selected as his spiritual wife. Typical lavish affections and gifts at the beginning of the process, and slowly they start to infiltrate your life. Once I realized it was a cult, they left out a lot of the details in the beginning and started slowly letting on. I started to distance myself. It was very hard because a few of them had become really close friends to me. Certain members followed me to my school building and waited for me outside my classes. 2 of the girls called me crying, begging to go to heaven with them. It was so tough to say goodbye. They really believed what they were preaching. Then I moved to the States and only received an occasional email from them. They still reminded me of my life number, just in case I ever wanted to go back to a church in my region and need to fill out any forms. A life number is what you receive the first day when you're baptized into their cult. The organization received an award for philanthropy from President Obama a few years ago. Genuinely kind people, always helping the poor, needy, doing volunteer drives, etc. Huge presence in poorer countries in South America. They also have expanded pretty extensively in Southeast Asia and China. But I ain't about that cult life. On the bright side, if it turns out that Ahn Sang-hong really is the second coming of Christ, I still remember the prayers and shit, so I'll be all good, I guess. I was in a cult called True Jesus Church, or the TJC. They are nice and loving people. However, it is the teachings that is all wrong. They have deviated from the mainstream Christian teachings and claim that they are the only true church that saves. All other churches are false because they do not follow the truth as they claim. However, being a member in that cult for many years, I have seen the cracks of their lofty claim of truth is nothing but an excuse of superiority complex. Likewise, it attracts people of the same personality to it. Those who want to control, and those who are willing to be controlled based on fear, not questioning the authorities of the so-called truth that they preach. For me, I am the submissive sheep taking in the poison that they preach every Sabbath Saturday, to the point of falling asleep in sermons, which, if you look around during a TJC sermon, many of their members are sleeping disciples too. The defining moment is that I woke up to their poisonous teachings when I realized that they do not follow what they preach. It is when I realized their truth is merely good in the pulpit, not in daily life. On one hand, they preach to look for your soulmate within the church, not other churches or non-Christians. On the other, they allow couples that seek their companion outside of church to hold holy matrimony in the church. And after they say it's okay because we'll baptize them. I do not agree. Is it alright if the brother or sister have gone through the baptism for the convenience of marrying? Has baptism become a tool? What kind of truth are they preaching? Thank God for allowing me to experience this episode in my life. in order to see how true the True Jesus Church is. Sadly, many members do not see or feel what I feel, and most of them are still sleeping. They think that as long as the issue doesn't affect them, it'll be alright, because most of the adults are already married before coming into the church, and their youths are not really holding fast as to teachings, except for foolish youths like me who innocently, with a childlike faith, believe in the truth they preach. After I decided to leave the church, I got the opportunity to compare TJC to mainstream churches. It was hard leaving, because you are constantly haunted by TJC poisonous teachings that are ingrained in your mind. You will lose salvation because there are no other churches that save you except ours. You won't be able to find the true church out there. Only the TJC will save. It gives distress and fear and helplessness for those thinking of leaving the cult. Finally, I said enough is enough. I'm here and I'm free from their bondage. I researched other mainstream church doctrines and TJC doctrines and found out that many of their teachings are fundamentalists, i.e. believe word for word in the Bible. For example, they only baptize with head bowed down in living water, i.e. moving water, not still water or tap water. So to a TJC member, if you don't baptize in the manner their church says, you're not saved because you do not practice the truth. When I did an evaluation of both church teachings and my personal life experiences in both churches, I realized that my view of God is very myopic in TJC as compared to mainstream churches. Does God really send you to hell because you don't tilt your head in a certain way or do certain things for baptism? Does it mean Mother Teresa cannot be saved if she wasn't baptized? These are further questions that I woke up to, besides the missionary dating issue that happened to me personally. The TJC is a church that's really appealing to those new members with a superiority complex, i.e., it is we against the horde. We are the right ones, you are the doomed. If you want to feel high and lofty of your status as a special child of the Lord, this desire will naturally draw you to the church. For older members, they're on sleep mode. Things are peaceful until things happen in their personal lives and then they wake up, as most members choose to ignore such things that happened around them. If you want to attend such a church and survive, you have to be thoroughly ignorant to doctrine matters. My personal advice is, there are loving ones in the church, but they are few. Most are selfish and mind their own business, but don't attend a church based on the love others show to you. In short, be strong and make your own decisions. Don't just listen to everything you say and eat it up. It's important to know exactly what you're listening to, because they're slowly brainwashing you, convincing you that they are the only possible and palpable truth in the whole universe. And that is a very dangerous thing indeed. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Please be careful around cults. Don't get suckered in. It's incredible how even the strongest of minds can be fooled into joining, paying away their money and their time and effort. Be careful. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give it a big thumbs up. And why not subscribe and hit the little bell icon for even more stories every day. Don't forget that if you would like me to read your story on my channel, you can send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, both of which can be found in the description. Just be sure to follow 3 simple steps. Number 1, include paragraphs in your submission. Number 2, add as much detail as possible in order for it to flow smoothly. And number 3, maximize on punctuation. But anyway guys, for now I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.